Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 35th Annual Small Farm Conference. My name is Beatriz, and I work with Community Alliance with Family Farmers. And if you're here for Unpacking Soil Disturbance workshop, you're in the right place. If not, please stay. We're going to learn a lot in this workshop, and we have a wonderful panel here. Look at all these pretty faces. And so I'm going to set some ground rules right before we get started. I just want to say to keep the chat kind and polite. Please no soliciting. If you have a business, Evan shared earlier a cool board that you can go ahead and share that there. Please use the Q&A function in this Zoom webinar to ask questions to our panelists. It's actually the easiest ways for them to see your question, answer it right away, and it keeps it away from the chat where it could get lost and potentially not answered. So please definitely feel free to use that. I also want to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded hopefully onto our YouTube after the conference is over. Additionally, after this webinar ends, you will be prompted to fill out a little survey for us, and that really helps us get to know any feedback that you have back for us. And I just want to say thank you, Sara. Thank you to all our panelists for being here and our sponsors for making this space possible. And without further ado, take it away, Sara.
Thank you, Bea. Really appreciate it. And welcome, everyone. We can't see you, but we know you're out there somewhere. So my name is Sara Tiffany, and I'm the Director of Ecological Farming at CAFF. And I imagine by now you've hopefully heard a good amount about CAFF, but in case you haven't, we're a California-based nonprofit that's been working to build more sustainable and food and farming systems for 45 years now. And we have a lot of different programs. So if you're not familiar with the organization, I just encourage you to go check out our website. We work on everything from farm to market, food safety, small farm technology, wild farm resilience, policy advocacy, and I'm sure I'm forgetting lots of other things, and ecological farming, which is the program that I have the pleasure to head up. So as Bea mentioned, today we're really here to kind of dig into the nuances of tillage and no tillage, right? And the motivation for this panel discussion really came from growers, actually, who, you know, there's lots of presentations of research on no-till and reduced till and all of these things. And we got a lot of great feedback that, you know what, we really just need a space to kind of get into the gray area here and get away from kind of like a little bit of a dichotomy that can happen between till and no-till in terms of discussion and research and whatnot. So that's the plan for today. And just to kind of give you an idea, we're going to start out with some introductions, which we'll get into in just a minute. We'll then go into a discussion amongst our wonderful panelists here. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So as Bea mentioned, please do utilize that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to be bringing those questions in and getting to most of them at the end, or the last part of the webinar rather. And we're really looking forward to your questions, even your experiences. Please share with us. We want this to be as participatory as possible. So yeah, I wanted to just briefly introduce, and I'll let them take it away further, our four panelists here. We have Nathanael Siemens from the Rodale Institute, Graham Shelton from Slow Dance Wines, Tim Bowles from the Agroecology Lab at UC Berkeley, and Tommy Fenster from UC Davis, the Agroecology Lab at UC Davis. So have a lot of wonderful experience in the room, so to speak, of both research and practice in agriculture, looking at different types of systems, different kinds of ground management with tillage and no-till and whatnot. So I'm really excited to get started, and with that, I will kick it over to, I'll have each of you guys introduce yourselves and give a little bit of background of kind of how do you come to this work, and so that we all don't jump in at once. I'll kind of start it out. So why don't you give us, why don't you start us off, Tim?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Great to know all of you, all 100 of you are out there. And thanks for being here and sharing this time with us. My name is Tim Bowles. I am faculty at the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at Berkeley. With my wonderful lab, I run the Berkeley Agroecology Lab. We study mainly soil ecology, the functioning of the organisms and the cycling of nutrients and water in soils, and how different agricultural systems affect that. We have worked on tillage, particularly in a project that Sara has been involved with and has really been led and organized by a PhD student in my group, Cole Rainey. Cole may be here and could help us answer some questions later too, but this project has really been focused on small scale, so-called biointensive no-till systems around the Bay Area of California. This is a system that is more than just the lack of soil disturbance, but involves a number of other principles. We've been working with farmers to understand how this system affects things like soil carbon and the soil biology, particularly the soil nematode community. We've also had a trial going on in downtown Berkeley at a research station where we've looked at changes in soil properties, how that affects plant and crop resistance to water stress. And all of this is really thinking about how farmers have led the innovation and the development of this system and adapted this to their particular circumstances, because it looks really different in different areas. And so that's one kind of pole of my work, is in these very small scale, non-mechanized systems by and large. And then I've also done work looking more broadly at the effect of soil ecology, or excuse me, on tillage on soil ecology, things like particularly like mycorrhizal fungi across a wide variety of tillage systems. I'll pause there. I know we're going to get into the weeds of this a lot more as we go on.
Great, thank you, Tim. I'll kick it over to Nathanael.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Nathanael Gonzalez Siemens. I'm a farmer in the Bakersfield area. I have almonds here, and I also do some other farming in the northern part of the state with heritage grains, and we're trying some trials with cotton. I grew up on a cotton farm, so I'm kind of vested in trying to figure out if we can do an organic or regenerative organic version of that. My day job, though, is with the Rodale Institute. I'm a consultant with Rodale Institute. Rodale's been around for a while. They kind of based around the idea of organic research and now regenerative organic research. So we have a new center here in California, down at McGrath Family Farm in the Ventura, Camarillo area. And any of the research that they do there, I translate that into practical on the boots on the ground decisions for farmers and advice for farmers up and down the state. So that kind of on a day-to-day basis is a lot of agronomic advising, as well as certification advising, but it can be pretty diverse too. And as far as the no-till aspect of things, certainly tillage is a concern, for everyone, and we get a lot of questions about that. A lot of it is just pragmatic. How do I make this particular implement work on the ground, literally? But a lot of it's fairly theoretical too, and there's certainly some blending of the research and on the ground practice, especially with Jeff Mitchell's CIG grant, which I've had the good luck to participate in for the last few years with Scott Park and Phil Foster, UC Santa Cruz staff, and the results have definitely been very complicated at best. So I'm happy to kind of wade into that, and yeah, that's me. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Nathanael. All right, Graham, you want to give us an introduction?
Yeah, hi, I'm Graham Shelton. I'm let's see, a 10-year wine farmer, grape grower. I make the Slow Dance wines here in Sonoma. I started doing this work when I was 22, living in France. The first time I hopped on a tractor and was able to really just get into this work. And now I have a sort of part-time, full-time job with North Bay Vineyard Management. We farm roughly 30 to 40 acres between Napa and Sonoma County. So my job can be doing anything from mowing to tilling. So just seeing that experience on a day-to-day basis. And then I farm vineyards for myself. Currently farming around like 3 acres now, and implementing for myself a no-till system on all my vineyards. So I'm able to kind of see what vineyards look like on a tillage-based system to a no-till system, and been seeing that over a course of 5 years now in terms of my kind of sample in time. And I'm excited today to be here. The thing with me is that, yes, boots on the ground, seeing a lot of this stuff in work, but, kind of knowledge is power in this industry. And the more people that are doing research and really digging into this, it can inform my decision because, I'm really looking out into the future with the health of these vineyards. But I have to do the work today or tomorrow. So, making a day-to-day decision with the help of research and other people is something that I'm excited to dig into. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Graham. All right. Last but not least, Tommy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tommy Fenster. I'm excited to be here and on this panel with all the other great panelists. Let's see, I'm a PhD student at UC Davis. For my master's, I worked in almond orchards, and we're looking at the stacking of sustainable practices to create these regenerative farming systems in almond orchards and how they compare to conventional counterparts. This is all on-farm research, so looking at actively farmer-designed systems. And a lot of that research was really to examine, how did the stacking of these sustainable practices potentially lead to improvements in soil quality and biological metrics, as well as farm profitability. And tillage, is one of those practices that we were looking at in that research. And, we'll kind of dive into, really, I think when we're talking about tillage, it really comes down to, what kind of other practices are you potentially combining with it? And it's really a very context specific question in a way as well, too. I've continued working in almonds now through my PhD, but really my big focus is on vineyards. And in vineyards, again, we're wondering about stacking of sustainable practices in vineyards. We're really interested about grazers in this case, what kind of disturbance or grazers bring into these systems. But again, tillage is sort of a key agricultural practices. So really curious about how do these different practices interact to affect the soil quality and biological community? What is the interaction between soil quality and the biology and all these management practices? And yeah, just excited to discuss this issue of tillage with everyone. And I think we'll, I don't think we're going to get an easy answer at the end of it, but I think we'll hopefully have a more informed understanding of how it all works together. But yeah, I'll leave it at there.
Thanks, Tommy. I also have that hope. Yeah, and I guess to kind of get us going, I think it'd be great to kind of think about what you all have seen as the role of tillage from sort of a conventional point of view, so to speak, in either annual cropping systems or perennial cropping systems, because I think it's fair to say it's different, right? There's some overlap there, but also some nuance. And so I'd love to hear from anyone who wants to share in the cropping systems you've worked in, annual or perennial. Just reviewing, like, what are the key roles of tillage? How does it differ between different differentiate between a conventional system, for example, and an organic system. And yeah, talk a little bit about that if you can. Don't all jump in at once there.
I guess I can kind of hop in. So maybe I can kind of start. I'm mostly working in perennial cropping systems. I'll let maybe someone speak to it more in these annual cropping systems. But certainly in an orchard system, especially with almond orchards, tillage overall, especially in more conventional systems, is fairly limited at this point. You're not going to see a conventional, for the most part, conventional non-organic almond orchards are probably not practicing tillage. So the role of tillage would more be in a organic almond orchard system. And the reason for this tillage would be because they don't have the same tools as a conventional farmer for weed management or maybe for nutrient management. So in this context, what I've seen in sort of the research is why an almond farmer may till. Maybe they would use sort of a more surface level roto tillage, not going very deep, but to prep an orchard for a cover crop because they don't have a no-till seed drill to use. Maybe they would use tillage to incorporate their cover crop as well as manure. Maybe they're not on a solid set sprinkler system, so they can't really kind of water in that nitrogen, so they really need to incorporate it in. And maybe, or they're on an older flood irrigation system, so they need to incorporate some shallow tillage to allow that flood irrigation water to kind of make its way through the orchard system. So that's and then of course you do have some organic almond orchards that are not utilizing tillage, and maybe they're using some combination of mowing or grazers to do that. But then again, that maybe will come with some different trade-offs, and whether you use is going to depend on everything from your irrigation system, your rainfall that year, your cover crop. So I feel like I kind of spoke enough, and I know I can talk about vineyards, but I feel like I think Graham would probably be better to speak about vineyards, and other folks would be better able to speak about it for annual cropping systems.
Yeah, I wonder if Nathanael, you'd be willing to kind of jump in and talk a little bit about the role of tillage in annual systems.
Sure. So similar to what Tommy mentioned, the cover crop termination and incorporation is important in annual systems. But in addition to that, annual systems, especially row crops, weed control is probably the primary reason for tillage, especially with an annual crop that's slow growing relative to weeds, which isn't all of them. Surprisingly, there are a few annual crops that grow faster than weeds, but most of them you'll need to have some tillage in order to. Like our cotton, it's impossible. It's thus far it's been impossible for anyone to imagine an organic cotton system without tillage-based weed control. The other important reason for tillage it's used in an organic and conventional context is bed prep, and the kind of the confluence of bed prep with cover crop incorporation is kind of that's where a regenerative system is kind of aiming for something where you got a quick turnaround between your cover crop incorporation and your bed prep and your seed planting, and that's been kind of the tricky part for a lot of people thus far. So an organic system that has tillage is probably going to have a larger gap between those. Anyway, we can go into those details, but yeah, the weed control, bed prep, and cover crop termination incorporation are your main annual crop uses.
Thanks, Nathanael. That's really helpful. And yeah, and I wonder, I guess, kind of bouncing back to perennial systems as well. I certainly know, that just ground leveling in perennial systems, maybe there's a reduced till orchard, but because of rodent pressure, right, needing to use tillage to sort of, knock out some of those burrows and do some ground leveling also seems like an important kind of function that tillage is used for. Yeah, and I'm wondering if we could kind of, I guess a question I have, and maybe Tim, you can kind of get us started with, but it seems that in some ways tillage has gotten a little bit of a bad rap in regenerative ag circles, and I think there's been a lot of research, and I'm curious if you could kind of speak to the context around that, or maybe that's a poor way to frame it. But there does seem to be a developing dichotomy between, like, you're either a no-till system, which is in some circles would be referred to as kind of like what we're going for, or you're a tillage system and you're not realizing those soil health benefits. So can you kind of get us started talking about that that framework?
Yeah, sure. And there'll be so much to get into here. We won't cover it all, but I'll start. I think before we get into the soil side of things, I think there's also this historical phenomenon with tillage where, so to a certain extent, over the course of the 20th century, as bigger and bigger machines were introduced, there was this phenomenon of sort of we do more tillage to counteract the damage that we've done from tillage, and so I think that's part of this recognition, is like we've gotten as machines have gotten bigger, as compaction has gotten worse, and we it's almost like we're stuck in this place, and very, very broadly speaking, where tillage is kind of like we're kind of feeding the beast a little bit. And so backing out of that, I think in terms of the why tillage has gotten a bad rap in regenerative agriculture, as we focus more and more on soil and soil health, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that we have to remember that soil is, half of it is pore space. That is, half of the volume of soil is either air or water, depending on how much moisture is in the soil. And that pore space is critical because it's what holds water. It's what allows oxygen to diffuse into soil, to keep microbes active, to keep roots alive. And that pore space is a fascinating result of soil structure. And soil structure is the result of this interaction between all of the life that lives in soil and all of the particles that make up the physical parts of soil, the sand, the silt, the clay, and the organic matter. And soil is this fascinating self-organizing system. That means that it is a system that changes itself over time as microbes and roots start to create soil particles that stick together, that form aggregates, and those aggregates sort of stack on top of each other to form this amazing pore space in soil that constitutes all of this soil structure. So fundamentally, I think that's the tension here between tillage and soil health, is that tillage is mechanically disturbing this soil structure. It can break up these aggregates that have been formed through the action of the soil biology. And in the short term, tillage might actually create more pore space, more big pore space, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons that people have used it, is because in the very short term, it can allow for more water infiltration. It can aerate the soil. It can stimulate mineralization of nitrogen that organic systems need. But over the long term, we see, or at least in theory, we see a decline in soil structure. And because of all this mechanical disturbance and the release of organic matter that's protected inside these aggregates, we can also see a decline potentially in soil organic matter. And so I think, to me, that's the fundamental reason why tillage has gotten a bad rap in regenerative agriculture, is because of this relationship, because of its effects on soil structure, and this tension between the importance of soil structure and the long-term sustainability of soil, and the short-term benefits that we might get from tillage.
Anybody else want to chime in there?
Yeah, I'll hop in here. I think sometimes we come to tillage not knowing fully all this information about tillage. Sometimes it's this thing that, oh, they did before me and then they did before me, and so I'm going to do it this year again. Maybe some farmers in this group have that experience of like a parent or someone just said, no, this is how we do it. And I remember when I was living in France and first kind of experienced tillage, I was asking my boss at the time, they were doing a sort of, I don't know the implement, but they were basically uplifting soil right next to the base of every vine, like almost putting like a blanket over the trunk. And I was like, what's this? What are we doing here? And my boss had a fair amount of English, but was basically telling me, oh, we're putting the vines to bed for the winter, and almost creating like a trough in which like water can collect and get to the root system. And I was like, okay, I guess that makes sense. So we come to these things in these really sometimes arbitrary ways without all this information. And then as I've continued to learn about tillage, now working for the company I do, we'll till every other row. And so you're mixing in cover crops as a part of that, sort of putting oxygen into the soil, but you also want to be able to capture water. So you keep every other row green, if you will. So then learning about that, they're not doing this, putting vines to bed at night, in the winter, if you will. So we come to all these different systems and hear different examples of this is why we do this, or this is why we do that. And I think it's really important to, and this is why we're here, right? We're gaining information to know why we should do something or not. But so much of tillage, in my experience, is just based on this is why we do it, and that, and only for that reason, end of sentence. And then, and any other thing that challenges that is sort of, well, maybe, or I don't know, we've always done it this way. So I think sometimes it's really important to sort of like step back and be like, okay, there's emotions involved, there's opinions involved, and that's sometimes that play on a small farm or any farm, honestly. So
thanks, Graham. I can definitely chime in on that one. It's been something we've seen plenty of, right? And I think that's why these conversations are so great, because we have an opportunity to expose the nuance. I'm curious if I get, maybe we started off a little bit on not the wrong foot, but I want to take a step back and talk about, like, what are we even talking about tillage, right? It's not just one thing. There's a lot of different ways people till. There's different kinds of implements. And if we are talking about, like, tillage does have some soil disturbance, which is what we're kind of talking about. Is there a gradient? Like, what are the tools out there? Have they changed a lot? And where, obviously will depend on access to equipment, but where are the access points for growers to sort of customize how they're even interacting with tillage based on what type of tillage they're doing? And maybe Nathanael or Tommy, if you could kind of get us started on that, that'd be great.
Thanks, Sarah. You just teed up a doozy there. Let's see, tillage implements. I mean, so we just had the Tulare International Farm Show over here in Tulare last week before last, and if you want to see a diversity of like tillage implements and tractors, and get into the gory details of where's your compaction zones at, and the ratio of compaction to pull it, to torque of the machine versus footprint of the machine versus depth of ripping shanks. Honestly, I don't know if I've ever heard a coherent answer to that question of where does the spectrum of impact go from what depth is a good depth versus a bad depth versus too heavy an implement versus too light of an implement. I'm sure that there's probably been lots of studies on it, but I have yet to see like a coherent or at least easy to digest format for that. And which I think is, this is getting a little bit esoteric, but I think is why the no-till pitch is so easy for people to accept, is because you just don't have to worry about all of those different nuances of tillage and soil types and everything. You just say no-till, that's the solution. You just don't till anymore, right? And everything's going to be fine. And so it's easy for a consumer or a farmer to to buy into that very simplified message. But to your answer, it's to answer your question, there's just an absolutely unlimited amount of implements that do an unlimited amount of various tillage to the soil, and we're kind of lucky out here in California that we, like Tommy and Graham have mentioned already, that that there's not a lot of tillage in a lot of our permanent cropping systems, whereas in the Midwest, it's they're dealing with this sort of question all the time. I don't know, Tommy, you have a little bit better answer to that. I feel like I just basically did a long-winded punt on that.
No, I think you kind of hit it perfectly. There's a lot of different implements that people will use for any variety of job and even the stage that the agricultural system is in. While I did say that almond orchards, for a lot part they are conventional, will not till, but that is during while they are being grown. But to prepare an almond orchard or to plant a new almond orchard, you will do a very intensive deep rip across the entire field, not even just the row. You'll essentially be kind of crisscrossing and deep ripping the whole field. And I think that's somewhat similar for a vineyard management, but that's also very expensive to deep rip. So when I'm talking to producers, I think just a few days ago, and they're saying how expensive it is to prepare for a new orchard. So they save a lot of money on startup costs by reducing some of this deep rip event. Maybe they're just going down the row. Maybe they're not sort of crisscrossing that whole field. So I think Nathanael did a good job. There's a lot of different tools and a lot of different times you will use tillage.
Yeah, thank you guys. And I guess also just like big picture wise, I think it's helpful to remember that the act of tillage started by hand and with horses or, draft animals, right? So the level of impact theoretically earlier on was a lot sort of gentler on our soils. And it's changed a lot. And there's a lot of, as you said, Daniel, there's a lot of different tools out there. And for those growers that are on the panel, maybe chime in here in the Q&A and we'll get to, we can share out your experiences later, but would love to hear, what are you using? What do you ideally like to use, right? Because we know there's a wide difference between disking with a mold bar plow and using a harrow, right? So just thinking about nuances from that point of view, I think can be really helpful. And I want to kind of go back to something you said earlier, Tim, about a strong motivating factor to kind of try to move some of our systems towards no-till or reduced till has to do with soil health. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit more, maybe from the research point of view, what are the highlights of that discussion right now in terms of the research that's been done? And what are some of the differences, for example, in folks that are trying no-till in California systems versus the Midwest, right? Which we know are very different from ours. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And again, won't cover everything, but I'll try to get at least 2 or 3 highlights in here. I think one, starting with the question around soil organic matter or soil carbon. This has gotten a ton of attention as we think about climate change mitigation. That is, how do we pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and how, to what extent can soil carbon play a role in helping us meet climate goals? And it would seem intuitive that no-till would lead to increased soil carbon. Everything I said about the mechanical disturbance of soil that stimulates microbes and breaks up the aggregates in soil that leads to a release of soil carbon. So it would seem like it's a no-brainer, right? Going to no-till should increase soil carbon because we don't have those disturbances. Interestingly, though, and this, when we look at the research, it's a lot muddier than that. When we only look at soil in just the top, say, 6 inches, we do often, almost all the time, see an increase in soil carbon in no-till systems compared to tilled systems in the same sort of cropping system. However, and that was the really consensus in the research community for a long time, because, it's hard to take soil samples deeper than that. It's hard to get an auger in there. Sara knows this well, having done a lot of augering. But when we actually measure soil carbon way down, like 3 feet deep or more, and compare no-till versus till systems, it's much murkier. Sometimes we see differences with higher carbon and no-till, but a lot of times we don't. What we see is what's called a redistribution of soil carbon, meaning that in no-till systems, we tend to see more carbon at the surface, but relatively less down deep than we do in tilled systems. Now, tillage is, in part, it's mixing the soil a little bit down deeper where it's actually protected from carbon loss. So even though it seems really intuitive that no-till should increase soil carbon, the research is not as clear on that. One thing that the research is pretty clear on is the impact of tillage on at least some soil organisms, right? There's this enormous diversity of life in soil. We often talk about microbes, and of course, microbes are just the majority of the actual biomass, the actual living mass in soil. But there's all of these other critters, right? And they have larger bodies. These are things like nematodes, which can be good and actually help control pests, as well as some of the pest nematodes that you might be familiar with. They can be things like columbella or earthworms, right? This whole range of soil organisms. And the research is pretty clear that the larger the body of the organism, the more of an impact tillage has on it. And that makes sense. Sometimes they're literally getting shredded by these tillage implements, or their habitat, which is these aggregates, all the soil structure, is getting destroyed. The impact on soil microbes is not as clear. Bacteria do just fine, and in fact are stimulated in tilled systems. And some fungi can do better in no-till systems because a lot of their biomass is in these long strands, almost like roots, that would get broken up by tillage. And the last thing I'll say, so I don't drone on too long here, is that while that is the case, there are other practices that can, even in a tilled system, can promote these types of important organisms. So one of the pieces of research that I had done a while ago was looking at all of the research that had ever been done on mycorrhizal fungi, these really key plant symbionts, and the effect of both tillage and cover cropping on these symbionts, on these mycorrhizae. And what was interesting is that no-till and cover cropping both increased the abundance of these organisms. But in tilled systems, cover cropping could stimulate these organisms almost as much as no-till did. In other words, even if you were in a tilled system, if you were using a cover crop, you were still getting the abundance of mycorrhizae that was similar in a no-till system. You got a little bit of an added benefit with both no-till and cover cropping together, but it was only a kind of a marginal increase. So my main point there is just that while tillage does have some clear effects on soil biology, there are other practices that can support that biology even in tilled systems. So I'll pause there, and yeah, anybody, I'm sure there's lots to add on there if anybody wants to.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I think that's a great snapshot, though. Tommy, I'm curious if there's anything specific to the research that you've done or looked at that anything you'd like to add there.
Yeah, no, I think Tim did a really nice job summing up, and I'll just kind of briefly kind of add to that a little bit. So in our research when we were looking at these almond orchards, and ones which were conventional, and then ones which came out as being defined as regenerative because they stacked multiple sustainable practices together. And then, we saw that these orchards that stacked these multiple sustainable practices together to create this regenerative system, they had significantly higher levels of soil carbon going down the 2 feet. They had lower bulk densities, improved water infiltration. They had bigger microbial communities. They had bigger, more diverse soil and vertebrate communities. Then we did sort of an analysis of, okay, which are the kind of the main practices that are contributing to driving these differences apart. And what we saw what the main practices were like working to maintain ground cover in the orchard, using organic amendments, reducing synthetic inputs, but not tilling did not come out as being a significant driver in these differences when we did that analysis. And I think part of the reason is pretty much in this, all the conventional orchards, they pretty much they all avoided tillage from their management, and some of them also used some organic amendments, but really the most they ever stacked or combined was sort of 2 of these practices: no-till, and then maybe some organic amendments. And kind of essentially what came out to, just avoiding tillage on its own isn't going to necessarily be enough to drive the improvements in some of these soil quality and biological metrics that we associate with soil health and a functioning soil. And no-till can certainly be a part of it, but it's really about trying to combine these multiple sustainable practices. And when you do kind of combine these multiple sustainable practices, some of these impacts on the biology or soil quality that maybe come with tillage certainly seem to be mitigated overall. So I think that was a really interesting piece. I totally thought like no-till was gonna hit really hard, totally hypothesized that. But then I thought this kind of analysis added some interesting nuance. And I'm really curious about how does grazing and tillage potentially interact? They're both kind of major disturbances. Are they both combined? Is that too much disturbance? I'm not sure. We're trying to ask that question. And maybe people who are out there in the audience or other growers have kind of worked to combine these and can maybe add some insights to that. But yeah, that's kind of my experience with some of the research.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, I think that's a great tee up for Nathanael. Nathanael, I know that you've done some grazing in your own farm, and also I think now might be a good time to kind of speak to okay, well, there are motivating factors to try to establish a reduced till or no-till system in our system. So what does it actually look like practically speaking? And Nathanael, yeah, if you could speak a little bit to your experience about trying out no-till in the systems that you farmed and that you've worked with, and then maybe also talking a little bit about your experience with grazing and how that factors in.
Sure. I was actually going to riff off of Tommy and say that I also had questions about some of the layering of variables on top of tillage. And the one I've been thinking about just today, just in this talk, is actually irrigation and how hydrology plays into tillage, especially in our high saline irrigation systems that are so common through in the Central Valley of California, all over California, I suppose. Which I don't have any answer to that. I'm just throwing that out there as another question. But let's see. As far as the application of no-till, we've done no-till, we've done till, we've done till and no-till in the same blocks on opposite years. So a lot of our decisions and the decisions that or the recommendations that I provide to growers are dependent on other factors like what equipment do you have available, what's your rainfall like? What's your irrigation like? What's your what seed are you using? What are you planting? So just a lot of pragmatics come into the actual application of that question of, you know, till versus no-till. And we've had success in our no-till systems, especially in our dry farmed grain and kind of field crop applications. Those, you know, if we're able to choose varieties that outcompete weeds, they tend to do really well in a no-till system. Also in our orchards, and we've had tremendous failures in our row cropping systems, and not for lack of trying. You know, we tried a whole bunch of different timings and implements and whatnot, and I'm not that I've given up on that, but I'm kind of like reached a wall of my own kind of ability to imagine what a no-till, you know, row crop system would look like. That said, there's always smart people doing creative things, and I have confidence that people will figure that out. As far as grazing, grazing is been a really fun tool to kind of unleash on our orchards, and it takes the place of a lot of weed control. Like our weed control costs have dropped by 50% easily because of grazing. And in some of the areas, most of an orchard and a vineyard, you can achieve weed control with mowing, so you're not actually tilling. But there are some areas, like especially up on the berms, where we're really flaming, or some like really specialized mower is really the only option, unless you've got some kind of grazing animal, sheep primarily, to come in and do that work for you. And in that case, they're a tremendous tool that's much more effective than any mechanized device that I've seen thus far. So that I think that the takeaway that I'm seeing is that grazing is a tool, and you know, with thoughtfulness and kind of a collaborative spirit around it, we can figure out how that interplays with other tools to make a system that's functional and hopefully costs less, or, you know, has some other benefits to it.
Yeah, thank you, Nathanael. I think that's a really good point, and I appreciate that you sharing your kind of diversity of experiences around trying out no-till at different systems, right? Because some are definitely seem like it's more practically feasible, right? And from what I've heard from you and other people is that when you're looking at organic vegetable production that's not on a really small scale, that's can be really challenging. And I think I've heard similar things from the SIG project you guys have been working on. Graham, I'm curious if you could kind of add a little bit in here in terms of what you guys do on your operation and your experience trying to reduce tillage or eliminate it, or, you know, what does that look like in your experience?
Yeah, so our kind of main program is first and foremost, like it's starting the winter, is getting cover crops in, and that we'll switch that up. We'll change that around, but in every row getting in cover crops, of course, you know, we're looking to add nitrogen to the soil, looking to try and capture rain as well, but and especially in those rows that stay green. But basically then what we'll do, we'll mow every row, and then the company I work for uses a French plow, and it's a pretty deep French plow. I don't have like a measurement. I couldn't tell you how deep it goes, but it's pretty deep. From that point, then we'll disc, sort of mixing that top layer, kind of providing like a dust mulch. A lot of growers in Mendocino actively use that method, so lots of sort of disking there, and then potentially another disking come late summer if we've gotten some summer rain or something like that. So just to give you an idea of what our system looks like, and that happens in every other row in terms of the vineyards that I'm farming. So sort of where then on my own personal farming, where I've then strayed is, again, what a lot of other panelists have brought up is equipment. So a lot of the vineyards I'm farming are about an acre in size, maybe a little bit more. And frankly, equipment is sort of a struggle. Sometimes it's using the neighbor's tractor, renting equipment in that sense. I'm sure there's plenty of small farmers here who are debating, do I take out a loan to get this equipment, or do I not, or what do I use? And so that's where a big function of grazing has come in for me. So I've been working with a local guy. Well, I'll bring in, even on my smaller vineyards, even as little as like 5 sheep that'll just sort of hang out for a month before bud break. And that's helped me out a lot, really reduced, just like Nathanael, really reduced the amount of weed sort of management I've had to do, reduced, my mowing, all of that sort of stuff. And not only that too, I just love how much soil disturbance you get. Especially if you're able to leave sheep there longer for a bit, you don't want to take the grass down too low. There's like a level, and there's a whole sort of Zen practice and grass management with that. I've had that explained to me. I'm sure some people know more. But you just get a beautiful sort of mixture, a sort of digging, a lot of soil disturbance that will happen. And there's a term for it, but you'll get these little holes that grazers will leave. And you'll see those holes then be a great source for, for water later on. Cover crops will take to those areas. It's really fun to see grazers mix in and really bring a little bit of life into the place. So yeah, sometimes there's issues with that though. It can be expensive on a lot of acreage. Getting a lot of grazers can be really tough. I know that's an issue for plenty of growers. It's easier to just, get the diesel from the gas station and get your tractor going and start mowing. That can be a huge factor there. But the thing with going to a full till system that I definitely notice, and I would love to talk about, is erosion. Erosion is huge. I really see this on hilly vineyards, and you really have this issue of trying to manage that, because if you're in a residential area, if you're in a certain area where you're getting a lot of erosion, it really can then just sort of, it seemingly takes away from the potential of the vineyard year in, year out. I'm sure, realistically, this is happening at a much slower scale. But what I sort of see with my own eyes is, you have issues later on getting good tilling to happen. So in a really rocky area, you might have really good take on that tilling early on. It might seem to really improve things. But then later on, you have issues with depth, have issues with impact on your soil, it seems like. So that erosion element is huge. And even in putting in cover crops, there's that kind of time period of, we're putting in cover crops, but then we're getting a ton of rain. So we're getting erosion. And then later on, our cover crops come up. We're going to mow them again. We're going to remove them again. So I find that that's been a huge thing that I've seen. And then in a sort of, positive note, I think a lot of growers, if possible, could really experiment with crimping. I know the Midwest is big on this, doing crimping and then using no-till drills to go into those systems. And so in a perennial system, if you can get a really good strand, a really good kind of cover crop, crimping is really nice. It's easy to just kind of create that mat. It's really easy to manage, maybe a couple of times, but at least once or 2 times a year, has proved really successful for us in terms of managing that. I don't know, I don't have the full science and the full research behind crimping and using crimping as a method here, but maybe someone has more. So I don't know. I hope that's sort of like a good idea of some of the systems that we've used, some things that I've seen. So.
Yeah, that's great, Graham. Crimping is a really interesting question, and I'm wondering if anyone wants to speak to that, because I've actually heard a lot of variability success with crimping. I think some of that probably has to do with the specific implement. My understanding is some of it has to do with, for example, if you're doing a roller crimp of a cover crop, it depends on what species of cover crop you're growing and also what stage it's at. I don't know if anyone here has could add to that at all in terms of, you know, from your own experience.
Sure, I can jump in on crimping just quickly. This is not my experience, this is kind of the Rodale experience, because I've only used a crimper a few times out here in the West Coast, but in the rest of the US where we're consulting, the crimper is one of the tools that Rodale is most well known for, most associated with. And our best luck has only been with rye, and it's only around anthesis. So your termination period is a very narrow window. And even then, even on a best case scenario, if you're talking about 1,000 acres, you're still going to have some rye that's not terminated. Rather, not that it's not terminated, but you have some rye that's probably going to go to seed, just because there's such the window for anthesis is so variable, even for domesticated plants. Outside of that, it becomes less and less guaranteed that you would have success based on factors primarily around the anthesis window and the type of stem that you have. So if the stem bends readily versus snaps readily, that creates the difference in crimping, because that's the main mechanism of termination, is to kill or to make the plant think that it's, you know, that it doesn't need to keep growing. So yeah, not a lot of success outside of rye.
Thanks, Nathanael. And I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of innovation actively happening in this area at a lot of different scales. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what tools are available in 5 years and 10 years. Yeah, and there's a question, just to clarify, if you could clarify what we're talking about, roller crimping. Could you give us kind of the quick and dirty on what it is, what we're talking about?
Sure. So a roller crimper is just a big cylinder that's pulled behind a tractor, or could be pushed in front of a tractor, that has slats along it. So as each one of those slats slams into the ground, it's crimping the stems against the dirt. That's all it is. Then, and just for reference too, you can achieve a lot of that same thing with just a mower, which are much more standard across California and the West. You know, mowers are kind of a dime a dozen. You can kind of have a lot better luck if you're chopping it off and kind of dumping the mulch upon the plant itself.
Thanks, Nathanael. So we're going to go into questions in just a couple minutes here, but I did want to, I guess, kind of step back and mention that, you know, most of what we've been talking about so far has to do with sort of tillage or no-till in mechanized systems, right? Which are often, you know, mid-scale, the higher end of small scale in terms of acreage, right? In terms of management, where you really, if you are going to, if you're going to reduce your tillage, you're going to transition to no-till, it is the implementation of it is heavily dependent on your machinery, right? But I did want to take just a minute, in part because there's a number of questions related to this in the Q&A, and talk about very small scale no-till. So I know that in past years at this conference, the Eagle Farm Conference, there's been presentations around these very, very, what we call often biointensive no-till systems that are, you know, you're talking about 2 acres or less, where it's not a mechanized system. And that is an area where there has been some successful no-till. Tim, you and I both worked on this, but I would love if you could kind of speak to what your guys' project in that system looks like, and to what degree it's been successful, and what important elements, in addition to reducing disturbance, are part of it.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I'll just note again, this has really been led by, this project has been really led by Cole Rainey. I think they might be in the audience. But what was fascinating, I think, to me about this project is the entry point was biointensive no-till, and interest in that, and lack of soil disturbance. But the more we got into it, that didn't actually seem like it certainly wasn't even, it was just one of many factors. What we quickly learned from the farmers that around the Bay Area, and also a little bit in the San Joaquin Valley, is that this is like, it's an entirely different farming model, in the sense that many of these farmers were looking for a way of achieving kind of economic viability without the capital and investments and equipment. And instead, they were investing in labor and very, very intensive systems. By intensive, I mean, and this is where some of the other principles came about, and some of this was learned from a kind of a conference we had on this back in, I think, 2019, is that the few other elements that seem to be common in these very small scale systems were extremely intensive rotations. So often based on transplants. These were mainly vegetable systems. So as soon as something in a bed or a block was finished, those plants were cut at the soil surface, and that same day transplants were going in. And so this meant that farmers were getting, depending on what they were growing, maybe 3 or even 5 or 7, in the case of greens, crops in the same area every year. So extremely intensive. So there was also tended to be a lot of organic matter inputs onto the soil surface as well. And all of this kind of worked together in this whole different system. Just to give you an example, we did a kind of an experiment on this, like I mentioned, in downtown Berkeley, on about a quarter acre, just a really small sort of demonstration experiment. And one of the fascinating things was we saw a lot of changes in the soil very rapidly that I could talk about a little bit more, but because of this different way of this high turnover, we were actually able to get an entire extra crop cycle in the biointensive no-till vegetable system compared to the till vegetable system, because we weren't having to wait in the spring to work the soil. We could get right in. We were also able to do creative things with cover crops. So for instance, we grew a forage radish cover crop and just cut the tops of the radish off and composted them, left this enormous taproot in the soil, and it decomposes within weeks and leaves this big hole that is perfect for aeration and water infiltration. So I'd be happy to talk more about some of our research results. Some of like I mentioned, we observed some very quick changes in soil. The soil fungal community changed within 3 years to be almost non-overlapping with the till system. We saw very rapid shifts in the soil structure that led to more water being held in the soil in the no-till systems. But the fundamental takeaway was that this biointensive no-till is just one aspect of an entirely different farming model that involved not only other practices, but a whole just different mindset in ways to achieve profitability. So so we can't divorce the biointensive no-till part of it from all of these other elements of these very small scale systems.
Thanks, Tim. That's really helpful. And, I think that's an excellent point. And I actually think there's a lot of overlap there with what we've been talking about in these larger scale or mid-scale, larger scale systems as well, right? That it sounds like a lot of it comes down to what is the suite of practices you're doing. And in particular, if you know, folks are really motivated by soil health, we know, okay, you know, soil disturbance has an impact on soil structure, but there's a wide range of practices that growers can implement. And oftentimes it's, you know, the combination and then the interaction of those practices is where you're really going to see acceleration in soil health. And tillage or lack thereof is just one piece of that puzzle. And I know that, you know, I think I've heard everyone speak to that, you know, it comes to the practical application of what function tillage or no tillage is playing in your system, and what other practices do you have going on? Because it's a little bit of almost like a, you know, input output framework in terms of building up that soil health while also making sure it's practically feasible. Because if you have a crop failure, your soil health numbers might not feel quite as good at the end of the season. So I want to go ahead and switch over to some questions here from the audience. Keep them coming. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. In order to give a little bit of time for this to kind of play out in the chat, I want to invite the panelists and also any people in the audience to share and recommend any resources that you have for folks that are interested in trying out no-till. I think there's been some specific questions around kind of what resources would you recommend checking out if you're interested in trying out vegetable no-till and vegetable systems. And so if any of you have anything you'd like to share there, including, you know, Tim, if there's somewhere where they can find a report on the research you're talking about. Yeah, and any other kind of resources and or tips for people who kind of want to test the waters in that direction. Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could just say sort of a general tip for resources. I mean, I think even I think Graham kind of alluded to before, but a lot of times, you know, the local NRCS and the RCD office in people's areas are a really great resource. There are some great general resources that you can go to, but I think there's nothing like potentially having someone come out and walk your farm and your piece of land with you and kind of really see what you have available to you and kind of come up with a more nuanced, site-specific, context-specific recommendation as well. So I'll just kind of pitch that, that resource. And yeah, CAFF is a kind of similar resource as well in that regard. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, real quick on the questions about is there the research I was talking about, is there anything out there? We are actively working on publishing this, and I'm going to try to find a link to a progress report that we had to submit to Western SARE, which was the funding agency that funded our work, and we have a progress report that should be public that talks about some of our preliminary findings that I can hopefully find here in just a second and put in the chat. But we're actively working on getting this out there.
Great, and thank you to Karen for dropping in a bunch of resources in the chat. And also, I think you dropped a link in earlier, Nathanael. Would you mind resharing that in the chat so everyone can see that? All right, I'm going to switch to, there's a number of questions here around cover cropping. And let's go with one that is, you know, fairly specific. So we have a question about if anyone has experience doing the chop and drop cover crops as a mulch and planting into that directly. So yeah, I know, Nathanael, you mentioned mowing versus crimping earlier, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all, if you guys have actually done that in your vegetable beds at all.
My experience with that is secondhand. It's through Paul Muller's work with the CIG grant up at Full Belly Farms. He did a lot of experiments with that. There's some really fun toys that you can use for that, some no-till transplanters with residue managers that do all sorts of fun stuff with the, when you do the chop and drop, and then you move the drop out of the way so you can plant into it. That said, his experience, at least as of last year, those experiences that he communicated with the group were not very successful. Not that they were failures per se, but there was a lot of they just weren't as robust as a traditional integration, and then bed prep, and then integrating the drop part, the mulch, as a green manure, and then planting into it. And just for reference for everyone, the theories, which are absolutely not grounded in reality, but the theories that smart people came up with, that is that it could be that there's still some residual allelopathic activity in the soil that from the plants that were just recently alive, or they still basically are still alive, the ones you just terminated. So the roots might be creating conditions that don't make germination or kind of a transplant very viable directly into that soil, or the soil temperature is still too low, and that's a well-documented aspect of a no-till system. When you've got mulch on the surface, it drops the soil temperature, which is beneficial sometimes, but not when you're trying to transplant or plant a new crop of seeds. So look into strip tillers and look into no-till transplanters if you do want to kind of play with that. But know that it's you're probably going to want to try out a bunch of different scenarios to see what kind of the optimal conditions.
Thanks, Nathanael. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think, as any grower in the audience knows, the farm's the real laboratory, right? So even though we can, hopefully kick around good ideas and recommendations here, a lot of it's going to be trialing it on your own ground. There's a question here that I think it's always important to uplift, and yeah, wondering if we can speak to how to manage rodents in no-till or reduced till systems. Graham, do you want to try, or anyone else want to chime in there?
Yeah, I think, yeah, specific rodents are have their own issues. Voles are, I know, a nightmare for a lot of people. Don't have that issue here. I know in Oregon, plenty of growers have vole issues. And that's pretty tough. I know keeping a dog around has helped. I've heard some growers talk about that. Yeah, I think this is where I have a vineyard specifically where me and the owner were putting out gopher traps for 2 hours. I mean, of course, that's really hard on a large scale, but on an acre and a half, we were just got down on our hands and knees and we're just going at it. So something like that. Again, the gophers aren't a huge issue for me, but he had some annual crops he had nearby and wanted to deal with that. So I don't recommend that to everyone, but I think the biggest thing is it depends on what you're growing. Of course, I think Nathanael could probably speak more to dealing that in an annual system. In a perennial system, especially for vines, voles are our biggest, one of our biggest issues. And I have ground squirrels as well. In one of my vineyards, they'll come and eat my fruit come harvest. And that's tricky too. Again, that's about setting traps. Otherwise, bringing in raptors are my best issue there. I know as someone reached out to me and asked if I needed owl houses to help kind of promote that, but ground squirrels are day animals, so owls are no help there. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a little bit of my experience there. So I have some other questions for other people on the panel, but maybe we come back to me or whatever we want to do.
Sounds good. Tommy or Nathanael, any notes on rodents?
Well, yeah, I think that is sort of one of those trade-offs potentially. I know sort of in orchard they really like if there's a thick mulch residue, right, sort of at that tree base, the rodents, they can really kind of get in there. And managing for that is sort of some of a trade-off and a struggle with issues. I know trying to increase your overall biology and raptors can, but even sometimes that's really hard to maybe even have high enough raptor populations to manage with that. And it's also maybe kind of looking at this as maybe you're not always no till or till, and maybe you do come in with a tillage event every few years, and it's sort of this trade-off you have. You're saving that diesel and that labor, trying to do that tillage every year, but maybe there is sort of, we think about integrated pest management where these economic thresholds hit, and there's techniques, right? You do every other row, and so I think, right, maybe we're not looking, we don't have to be fully till or no till, and there's some flexibility in there as well too. And I do see someone mentioning about terriers, and there is a 20-acre almond orchard that I work with, and that they have 3 or 4 terriers, and I've watched them eat them alive out in the orchard while I've been sampling. But again, that's like sort of a much smaller context, and you're dealing with managing the 5,000 acres of almonds. That could be a whole nother biological issue, having packs of terriers that's roaming around those fields. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, that's an image. I'll just add in, I think, piggyback on what you said about, again, this not being an all or nothing, right? It's a lot of what growers do is in response to what's happening out in the field. And I know several, perennial crop growers that do a tillage event, every 3 to 5 years based on gopher damage. And just, if you're harvesting nuts, for example, and you're no-till and you have a lot of rodent pressure, the ground gets so uneven that you actually have problems with harvesting, right? So then it becomes a very, practical need to try to level out that ground. I think this is a really interesting question someone brought up, and I've definitely heard it before. I'm not sure to the extent that you all are familiar with the work of John Jevons and double digging. So another sort of very specific type of farm system that actually involves quite a lot of soil disturbance, and like taking that juxtaposed to say like a reduced or no-till system. So, and maybe this is a question, well, for anyone, but I'm wondering, Tim, you may have had experience in this in terms of, this idea of setting up a particular plot. Oftentimes the double digging is, this is manually done. So it's very small scale, right? And it's setting it up, incorporating amendments, and really trying to drive the roots deep in the ground, and using that as a method to build soil carbon, as opposed to what we've seen on these really those really small scale no-till vegetable operations. And could you, I don't know. I mean, I know it's tricky and there's a lot of gray area, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. Now, just sort of the caveat that, this is not something we've looked at in particular, but I will say this, with patience, I think roots can do a pretty good job of getting down deep and loosening up soil. This is work from soil scientist Ray Weil in Maryland did some really neat stuff on this with forage radish. And of course, this forage radish has been used in Asian systems for a long time for this type of purpose. But thinking about biological tillage and different grass roots can also penetrate really, really deeply. And what they leave behind are these so-called biopores. These are little pore spaces in soil that after an annual plant dies, its root decomposes, and you're left with that space where that root was, that is great for water infiltration and aeration. And so but it does take some time. There was a neat study that was done that was tracking over about a 10-year period, the changes in soil structure that happened after tillage ceased. And it really took 7 or 8 years for the soil structure in this study under no tillage to really redevelop, because you actually get some compaction early on when you stop tilling. But eventually, those roots and time will, I think, do a pretty good job of loosening up soil. This is not to knock the idea of double digging. You can really accelerate that quickly by all that, but it's a lot of work. And so, we can, with the right plants and some patience, we can do a lot of similar functions.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and I think I think it goes back to this idea that there's a lot of layers here, right? And in both in terms of practices and the conditions that you're working in. One thing I wanted to come back to that there was a question about is kind of thinking again a little bit about water. And I know that Graham, you spoke to, dealing with erosion issues on, steep hillsides. That makes a lot of sense. I think there was a mention earlier about, water holding capacity that obviously we associate with, increasing our soil organic matter, for example. And so I guess a question I would have for you guys is, what are interactions between soil disturbance and water, whether we're talking about infiltration or runoff erosion, maybe specific to soil structure, that it's just important for folks to be cognizant of, say, when they're deciding whether or not to do a tillage event versus a mow versus some other option. I don't know who might want to kick us off on that one, but.
I can give that a shot. Just a couple, this is not a thorough answer. This is just going to be kind of a few points that I've been thinking about over the course of the last hour. One is that water access for our orchard, I'll talk about that specifically. So in our orchard, water is super important for our trees, obviously, but it's also important for our cover crops because we have a flood irrigated system. So we can flood our centers of our aisles and raise up a cover crop, which you wouldn't be able to do if we had a sprinkler-based or a drip-based irrigation system. We're installing those systems so that we have more optionality with the trees, but we're going to keep the flood so that we can keep the cover crops. But the second part of that, and maybe the more important part, is that allows us to get aquifer recharge, which is very important these days for all sorts of local and regional considerations. But I think the takeaway from that is that your water has a tremendous impact on what you're able to plant and where you're able to plant those things. So if you're making decisions early on about if you're planting on a contour or on a grade, and you're setting that land work, that earthworks up initially, then that gives you more optionality to use a deep irrigation system, which also happens to get rid of rodents pretty well too, to loop back to the previous question. So anyway, those are just some kind of first thought things about.
Thanks, Nathanael.
I wanted to hop in really quick on a couple of things. So I feel like a lot of people that might be listening, they're going to do some research, they're going to do some digging. And Tim, they might get to this moment where, and Tommy, they might get to this moment where, if I could just get a measurement that's saying like what's measured gets managed. And so they might want to get some soil analysis done or something like that. Do you have any recommendations for people when it comes to doing that? And is that a viable option for people in kind of getting a a basis for, should I be tilling, should I not? What cover crops do I need? What, you know, what other things should I be doing?
Tommy, feel free to jump in too, but I'll take a first shot, which is acknowledging that the commonly available commercial soil tests have some limited utility. They're mostly focused on soil chemical properties, different macro and micronutrients, and maybe total soil organic matter. I'll say this more from the experience, not as a researcher, but of talking to a lot of farmers. And I don't know if Graham and Nathanael, this resonates, but what I hear consistently is, well, the plants are the best. Is what I look to when I really want to understand soil health. And that can come not only from looking at your catch crops, but also on the patterns of growth in your cover crops. It might, the pattern of growth across the field might point out some challenge areas with poor drainage, for instance. And there is, and if I have time and I can find it, there is a nice link. There are some good that I could send. There are some good just like field tests that you can do. Some back of the some heuristics, let's say, on the amount of residue cover that's there. There's a so-called slake test that you could do. That is basically how quickly does your aggregates dissolve in a jar of water. So there are some kind of things that you can keep track of. There's also, the last thing I'll mention is at least as far, there's a couple of soil health testing labs specifically. There's the Cornell Soil Health Test that measures a wider range of properties that can be good for keeping track of things beyond just your basic sort of soil fertility test that is most common. And I can put a link in the chat for that as well. But for many of these, I'll say, especially with tillage and the physical properties of soil, the how water is moving in or out, it can be really hard to test out in a lab in your own observation. Going out after a big storm, looking at how ponding is or isn't there. How much runoff are you seeing? Is there a lot of sediment in your runoff? These are all things that can probably be more informative than a lab test when you're really thinking about some of these benefits of reducing tillage that we might see. That was kind of an all over the place answer. So if anybody wants to add anything that.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that as well too. I mean, even with regards to your soil biology, monitoring, taking a shovel out there, digging into the soil, noting how easy that shovel goes into the ground, looking at how the soil holds onto the roots, counting earthworms, tracking some of this over time. Say you're making a management decision and tracking that, taking good notes. But then of course, there is possibilities, for inorganic systems to integrate some pre-season soil testing to look at your nutrient levels, to do some calculations on how nutrients might get mineralized and become available over the course of the season. And then also, doing some leaf testing at some key points, with vineyards, taking your petiole analysis at a certain time, that post-bud break, after the post-bud break time, then again at that 50% veraison, and then kind of see how successful your nutrient management regime were over the course. Just observing. I like the water infiltration test, pouring into a 6-inch ring, 444 milliliters of water, timing that. I think that's it's a nice test that you can track. Not too hard to kind of get a 6-inch ring with some bevel from most kind of farm machine shops or something like that.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut you off just a little bit there, Tommy, because we are out of time, unfortunately. There's some really great resources that have been dropped into the chat, and I just want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you guys so much for being part of this discussion. I know I've learned a lot. Apologies for the questions we weren't able to get to. Feel free to follow up with us at CAFF or track these guys down. They're all doing amazing work out there. And yeah, just want to thank everyone for coming and encourage you to, continue to think critically about how these different factors interact at your farm, and understand that the more we observe, the more we learn. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Beatriz, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you so much, Sara. And thank you to all of our panelists for being here. I love that all of you use that little reactions emotion. It always feels so nice to see all those hearts and clapping hands and cheering on our panelists where they're going. Thank you guys so much for using that option. It really does add a little bit of more life to these webinars. And yes, like Sara said, you can definitely go back to your sched. That's where you can find the information of all your panelists, and you can follow up with them there as well. And I just want to thank everyone for being here and staying around. I know that these workshops are some of them are long, but they're so much full of good information, and they're so jam-packed. And I'm just so glad you all stayed. So yeah. Hope to see you on the rest of the workshops, and remember that we have the in-person gatherings as well. So definitely want to see your lovely faces in person, and don't forget to answer that survey at the end. Thank you all. See you later, and see you in other workshops.
Thanks all.